It's actually two titles, and thanks to New Lines for offering two titles, because the first one that I chose was Dust Over Dahiyeh. And you're right, the subtitle is Hassan Nasrallah, the Killing of a Killer. It's my way of trying to understand why I felt no respite or closure to something that had defined my life for the better part of 11 years, meaning why it did not bring any solace. Not one shred of positivity went through me, and I wanted to understand why. And thanks to them, they asked me to do it. It was an opportunity for me to try. And I think somehow I found the answer, which is that this is far from justice. It actually is just the killing of a killer. And that's why the title, I think, it made its point clearly. I don't know if satisfaction would come even if the most poetic form of justice was delivered, meaning, let's assume a parallel journey where diplomacy wins and all sub-state groups disarm, and the Lebanese state recovers, and Hassan Nasrallah himself announces the disarmament of Hezbollah. I don't know if that would also bring some kind of closure. I think these are permanent wounds, with or without justice. But the reason I think it didn't feel in any way conclusive is because justice is not delivered through war. In my experience, violence is not a path to pursue peace. It actually brings more violence. And that's why I wrapped up the piece knowing that the dust over Dahiyeh hasn't settled, that this is going to be, I think, bad years to come. What those years look like are too premature, maybe. But it's definitely somebody who fought to the end, and I don't think that fight brought any closure to his victims and those that are supporting him until today. I think we're all stuck in this together. No, I think it's more of a universal trait. I don't know if it's this country is not big enough to proclaim anything on the globe, but I doubt it's a Lebanese experience. I think in any case, violence is not a path forward, it's a path backwards. Interestingly enough, the same way many people are looking at it, which is through the camera. I'm also watching the news, like many people across the globe. Living in Lebanon can be at times confusing when you're living in a war zone, yet going about your daily life, and that's the norm here. So I am watching the news too. But that said, it is definitely a country that does not resemble the way I grew up, meaning transition from civil war to recovery, or at least an end to political violence to a degree, and a path for recovery. That is my generation's experience, the last 40 years, of knowing what's terrible and knowing what's better. I sense this time around things are falling apart faster. And there is a reason why I keep this newspaper print behind me in the background. That's the first day of the Civil War, and it's a capture. It's a sort of a very brief moment where you have Palestinian guerrillas led by Yasser Arafat and Lebanese militiamen fighting it out. That's in April 14, 1975, one day after the war. In my mind, we're trapped somewhere there still until today. And I think as long as the Palestinian cause is fought in a way that's bad for Lebanon within its borders, I sense this is a permanent problem. I don't think countries can fully get out of this kind of situation without falling apart. Long may be an understatement. I think it could be potentially permanent if there's no resolution to what Iran has built in the last 4 decades, and if there's a permanent conflict where somehow the Palestinian cause is turned into something less Palestinian and more external regime survivability, I fear Lebanon can be at war permanently. And I doubt any signal from proactive diplomacy underway is really interested in shielding Lebanon rather than exposing it. One word always intimidates me, and that's stability. Stability in Lebanon is not a good thing. Stability is what we're going through, status quo. You can't have both. You can't host a war and also govern effectively. And you can't be a battlefield and try to reform. You asked a bit about what collapse feels like. Collapse is not just war, it's also economic crash. My money is worthless in Lebanese accounts. I don't know if I will ever get any of that in serious amounts back. And I speak on my behalf alone. There's many Lebanese across the world too that lost their savings. That's part of it. That shouldn't be happening 34 years after the end of a civil war. It shouldn't be happening 24 years after the Israelis left Lebanon. Add to that, almost 2 decades since the Syrian occupation ended. The older problems ended. What we have now is something else, and it takes me back to the 1980s, which were the worst years of my life, where you have a country that is largely ungovernable and canton-like geographies that become more and more separated. And somehow in the middle of that story, violence erupts. And I worry that in the long war, Lebanese will also fight each other again. It's interesting. I've been asked many times to comment on the Israeli Prime Minister's words. And in news bits, it's Netanyahu followed by me, which I find very odd. What Netanyahu says to his audience and the way he delivers it, I don't think matters one bit to what Lebanese are thinking or going through. Netanyahu's words, I think, are best served for an American audience that wants to hear a very American-sounding Israeli diplomat turned prime minister who's at war, and I think he offers comfort to Americans more than anything else. So I don't really care for Netanyahu's desires. What I do know is that the Israelis are fighting security their way, meaning they are dictating the terms without any care or consideration, which means diplomacy has failed and war is winning. To me, at least, in my experience in Lebanon, what the Israelis do for Israel on Israel's terms, oftentimes, if not every time, makes it harder for Lebanese to rebuild. And what Netanyahu wants to see doesn't interest me. But what I do know is that the more the Israelis bomb, and the more the Israelis do symbolic gestures that fall flat here, whether it's installing an Israeli flag for a social media clip, it doesn't matter if it's 10 minutes or not, and it doesn't matter if they withdraw the flag and no one's watching. That, to me, is far more symbolically destructive, and that, I think, opens the hearts and minds of Lebanese to lean back on what everyone refers to here as resistance. And I don't know if Hezbollah will ever recapture that word effectively. It may be over for Hezbollah and its long-term raison d'etre to fighting the Israelis. I don't know how this round ends for them. But I do know Lebanese will veer back to the sub-state the more the Israelis bomb. It goes back to my article, which is why there's no respite for what the Israelis are doing to Hezbollah, even when I would assume most Lebanese today want an end to this war and some transition for Hezbollah too. But it can't be on Israel's terms. I don't know if we're really listening to him in English with subtitles in English that sounds like he's lobbying for an American audience. I don't think his words really matter here. What matters is what Israel's doing militarily. And that, I don't think, maybe in the long run helps diplomacy, or for that matter, Lebanon's governance. But this, I don't think, is on Israel's mind, let alone Netanyahu's. I don't think the Israelis really care as long as there's no fighting. That's all that matters. I assume that's all that matters to Israel. Hezbollah can survive in a Lebanon that doesn't bother Israel. I think that's fine for them. It's not about reform. It's not about effective governance. It's security being determined by a very deadly war machine on display. We can't hear it right now, but if we open the windows, there's a drone flying right above, and there's a psychological fear too. The Israelis don't gain any public sympathy when you're afraid all the time, especially when civilians die. These are not just targeted strikes. Civilians die. On the news, maybe it looks cleaner than it is, but civilians die. I'll answer this hopefully in a way that makes sense. In my experience in Lebanon, often covering this issue and talking to people who cover it in a very heightened way, where rhetoric can be quite aggressive against that group and against its leadership. It's my understanding, at least, that expression is not the problem. And for the most part, Lebanese can scream as much as they want about Hezbollah during peace, relative peace, and in the middle of war. I don't think public opinion really matters to this group. Unlike the way the Syrian army and intelligence once operated here, fear of even saying the word Assad on the phone. That's not the case right now with Hezbollah. I don't think they bother coverage, with all due respect to everyone covering it. I think they get interested when security is being covered, and I think they interfere when security could be exposed in a way that's bad for them. And I don't know what their red lines are right now, and I have no sympathy for their red lines either. But I don't think they're just rounding up journalists by default. And this is my understanding from other people covering the conflict right now, is that depending on how you cover it in ways that are macro-managed by them, I think can either get you favors or put you on their radar. I would point mostly to, at least until now, intimidation at a low level. A low level extends to social media, but low level can also include people monitoring. So low level meaning intimidation, real threats that are projected through violence. I don't know how it plays out in the long term, but I sense up until now the maybe bigger concern for Hezbollah, or what remains of Hezbollah, is trying to preserve its security capabilities and make sure none of that is exposed. How they deliver those messages may also depend who's covering it and where, but in the long run, I don't think they're really interested in just interfering with expression. I think you have to cross their security lines to get on their radar. I'll extend this further, with your permission. This is why I understand their assassinations in that light too. They did not go after people talking about Hezbollah in a very loud and at times insightful way. They went after security challenges on the ground, individually, and sometimes with the cover of a Lebanese state. Everyone talked about the pager explosions, which is an outrageous attack. And something like 1,500 Hezbollah members are either maimed or they're blind. The telecoms network of the country, at least the way it existed up until recently, was the state and a parallel network dominated by Hezbollah, which would monitor Lebanese officials and the airport too. And no one really remembers these things now because it's history. The last time Hezbollah fought on the streets of Beirut was in 2008. The Lebanese government tried dismantling that telecom network. That's also security for them, meaning intrusion on a paramilitary infrastructure that's difficult to preserve in a very ungovernable country like Lebanon. And that's where I see their red lines across the spectrum. I don't think of Hezbollah as politics. I think of them as war. And I think of their considerations not through parliament, but through a proxy machine. And that is, to me, my understanding of why they're still fighting and why they will not surrender, at least for the time being. This is not a political story. The political facade of Hezbollah is in the background, but it's not the story. There is something, I don't remember the exact number, maybe over 13, if not around 13, Hezbollah MPs in parliament, members of parliament. The war is not being fought out because of what those MPs want in politics. There is a political party called Hezbollah that even has municipal candidates, sometimes university students. The war is not there. The war is being fought on Iran's terms. And by proxy, I mean Iran's proxy. They're not fighting for Lebanese politics, they're fighting for Iran. And that's where you end up in a situation where their red lines are not the familiar red lines for other Lebanese groups. Their red lines are security oriented. There are many critics of Hezbollah in Lebanon that are alive. And there are many critics that are very, very loud and aggressive against Hezbollah in the last 20 years. They're alive. I think they're alive for a reason. It's that they don't matter, at least to that group. In times of war, red flags, and you're right, the security line may shift at times, and maybe, unfortunately, there can be a situation where there is an attack on civilians, whether they're covering the conflict, and they can be also at the wrong place at the wrong time. So there's no discounting the threat of real violence. But the last 20 years, that is pretty much how Hezbollah has operated. People can scream and shout, and they can kill Lebanese figures. They can stop a port blast investigation. They can launch wars in 2006 and in 2023. But people can talk about them, for the most part, as much as they want. I think it depends on when you ask them. And I think it depends on what you mean by Hezbollah. Clearly, no one voted for this war. It's an unpopular war. Fast forward over a year later, and there's increased sympathy for Lebanese fighting the Israelis in the south, whether they're Hezbollah or not. So I think for better or worse, both can be true. And the group that has dominated politics in a very suffocating way, in a paralyzing way, was unpopular. And I don't think that will change. It's hard for me to imagine political victories as a result of this war. Maybe psychological victories, maybe. I don't know how this ends for them, and I don't know what victory looks like right now for them. But it is an obviously unpopular war. And as they fight the Israelis in the south, Lebanese grow more sympathetic at the same time to what they call resistance. So I think both can be true. I'll add one thing. Hassan Nasrallah, before he was killed, himself admitted that they started this war on October 8th. So I think there's no discounting the truth, which is Hezbollah initiated what ended up being a very deadly round. But I cannot imagine Hassan Nasrallah predicting that this is how it would play out. Most media was covering this as a cautious escalation-like war for about a year. I think Hassan Nasrallah himself would have agreed to that. Netanyahu changed circumstances. This is why it's Israel's war right now. And this is where I get afraid of what's to happen to Lebanon long term. You can't eradicate, I don't think that's how humans operate. You can't eradicate a group. And I think you can probably eliminate all their leadership and there will still be an organization called Hezbollah. There's no eradication. But finding a constructive way to inherit what Iran built is maybe a very challenging endeavor. And in my understanding, it's the only one that you can bet on for a better country later. There has to be some way to bring the state to dominate all security matters in Lebanon. And that hasn't happened for a very long time. The last time Lebanon was functioning as a sovereign independent country, I don't think any of us were alive. That's the 1960s. That's the last time Lebanon functioned. And if it matters, the last time we had a regional war that Lebanon did not participate in was 1967. That's a war that changed the Middle East forever. And Israel did things you can't imagine today. Not only taking Gaza, but taking the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, taking Jerusalem and the West Bank from Jordan, taking the Golan Heights from Syria and annexing the Golan Heights, and a war that changed the Middle East permanently, but not one bullet shot across the Lebanese-Israeli border. That's 1967. It's a long time ago, but I think that's where the answers are. I would find a better word than destiny. I would call it something far less dramatic. It's called diplomacy. And you need a Lebanese state that can proactively make its case. It's not happening at the moment. It's a paralyzed mirror reflection of Hezbollah's needs. That's not a Lebanese state. That's a battered state. You also need a far more creative, resolution-oriented U.S. administration that doesn't want perpetual war. They call it stability. For us, it's perpetual war. That has to include, to some degree, persuading Iran that Lebanon is not its front line. How that happens, I have no idea. I think that's what Israel is doing on their terms. But their terms are not good for Lebanon. You need Lebanese terms. On the other end, something maybe unimaginable, maybe, is a U.S. administration that doesn't solely surrender to Israel's demands. And that is very hard to imagine, where the Americans see Israel as part of their diplomatic pursuit in a way that's good for other countries. Maybe that's not there yet, but if there's one country that should making that case day in, day out, it's Lebanon. We're the prime example of an ally that became a war zone, in my assessment, for no reason whatsoever.